Oh, share screen. Running. Okay. So to start with, just for the sake of the recording and for the sake of Laura, if she hasn't seen it, we're gonna watch 20 seconds of Evan Amison being a god. This is basically what you had posted as like how does he do this? um, so he's got his base sketch set up. He does a quick lighting and color study, and then he just kind of rips out a pony. Um, Obviously, this is very, very sped up. Um, but we're just going to take a look at kind of like, okay, what did he get from this? Like, why is this important? Why did he take time to do that? And he kept it up over here. What are these individual components, and then how is he kind of approaching his render, and how is he calculating that? And this particular workflow is a very illustration workflow. We're going to be covering a slightly faster version that is for concept art, but that can then be pushed up to this if you okay, so yeah, this is kind of the general topic here, looking at color theory as it applies to illustration, and then just keeping things cohesive, and then also looking at some more specific techniques for how to do that. Let me get my tablet plugged in because I forgot to do that beforehand. Okay, so first things first, before we look at any of this, we're going to do some very rapid fire refresher course on basics. And starting with color wheel and warmer versus cooler, right? The reason we need to know this is because lights affect the temperature and the value. So if you have a perfectly white light and you just make it lighter or darker, then arguably it will only be affecting value. But the vast majority of lights in real life are not perfectly neutral. You really only get that in some very specific photography kind of focused setups. So most lights are going to have some color temperature to them, and that is going to pull your local colors towards the light. That's basically like the TLDR of how it works. And the reason this is important and the reason I want to take a second about this is because a lot of people will think of like warm and cool colors as basically being like, okay, reds and oranges are warm, blues are cool. Most people aren't 100% sure, but generally loop greens in with the cool. And that is technically true, but when it comes to lighting, that's not going to be quite a complete enough picture. Because lighting is subtle. It just pulls it in that direction, but it doesn't actually like, if I have a red ball and I put a yellow light on it, it's not going to make the ball yellow, right? So when we take a look at like relativity, for instance, if I've got a blue like this and a blue somewhere in here, that feels really similar. Hang on, let me actually just use my so this is more like purpley, right? So if we look at this, this is purple. This is arguably a cool color, but it is warmer than our blue that we have on the left, right? And we can say that it's warmer partially because it looks warmer, and it looks warmer because it's going up towards the reds. Another good example is if we take a green over here, we've got this green, and then we can actually get a warmer green, even if I don't change the value much. This is cooler, this is warmer, right? They're both still green. This is, I mean, arguably you could say blue and purple, but they're still very, very close. Um, and so you can also do the same thing in like the warms, right? So if we've got an orange, as soon as we compare it to something, one is going to be warmer, one's going to be cooler. So if I move my hue wheel here down towards the cools, somewhere over in here, this is a cooler red than this orange is warm. And arguably, let's see if I can stay in the orange family. Let's pull a warmer orange. Here you go. So this orange is now in the middle. This is warmer. This is medium. This is cooler, right? And eventually we're going to end up going through the reds. If we keep kind of going on that trend, we're going to go through the reds into pinks, and then we're going to go through the pinks into blues. We're going to end up with this gradient of warm to cool, right? So the point of this is that color works very much the same as value in that it works just like I've said in a couple of these, like everything reads in context. So when you're judging value, especially if you're judging it off of something on the canvas, you're almost always going to be judging it in context with your other values. So a value can be inherently dark, but if every other value in your scene is darker than them, it's going to read as your light, right? So all of a sudden, this becomes my light. It's only if I add a value brighter than that that it now becomes a midtone. And if I add a group of values that's way higher, then these become my dark, right? It's all relative. There's no inherent um, like I don't know, truth to some of these, right? And the colors work the same way. If I just pick an arbitrary color, that's making a statement. And as soon as I put another color on my canvas, it is going to be warmer or cooler unless it's the exact same color. Now, with digital, and this actually is an issue that happens specifically with digital artists, because when we mix traditional colors, they have inherent hue shifts built into the pigments. There's really not any such thing as like a perfect white. Even like titanium white goes a little bit blue, and like there is no like perfection. Now in digital, we do have perfection because we're working additively. So I can literally take a blue like this, and then I can take it again and literally just take the lightness up like this. And you'll see this in digital a lot because artists will say, okay, um, I want to just make this lighter. This does a couple things. First of all, this does arguably go a little bit warmer because by going from our blues into the middle, we're technically moving towards the warm side. But this also is a really good way to make very boring color palettes. This doesn't really happen in nature that much, and this is where you'll get that very flat, beginnery looking art, is when you don't shift the hue with the value. Um, and yeah, here we can argue that this blue is lighter in value and slightly warmer because we're going towards the center. And you can think of this kind of like a plane that we're like traversing, right? So colors like to, we're getting into some basic color theory, but I'm just kind of giving a rapid refresher. Colors like to take the shortest possible path. So if we are in the reds and we are going towards yellow, they will go kind of straight through the grays for the most part. Sometimes you'll arc a little bit, depends on the color. But for the most part, you're just kind of charting a path from color A to color B, and your spectrum in between is going to be a straight. And then to make that spectrum more interesting, you can also make it go around. Now, we can get into all that later. Um, so real quick, one other thing, just since we're on color theory, when we have this example here being like a very digital mistake, we can take another example here where I'm going to take the lightness up, but I'm also going to move the hue a little bit. And you'll see that those colors, even if I try to make the same rough value to them. Okay, so these two colors harmonize slightly better, just because there's some hue motion as well as value. These are going to give you a more bland palette, and if we carry this across, you'll end up with just a very flat looking palette, basically. Okay, so that's our warmer and cooler and our kind of relativity. And the point of this, where we're going to go, is that when we bring lights in, as far as how it affects the value in the color, it will just basically pull the color, the local value or the local color of your object in the direction of the light. Now, a couple things. Number one, lights, obviously, different than shadows. Shadows are basically the absence of light. So light will always pull your local value up. There's really no instance where you will have light that pulls your local value down. Secondarily, it will pull your local value up and in the direction of whatever the color of your light. So in most cases, a very standard digital setup will be like we use a blue for shadows on multiply, we use a yellow for light on like overlay or something. And that works because it's kind of simulating like we get blue ambient light, which means our shadows are kind of a bluish tone, and then our sun is yellow, so it pulls it yellow, right? What we can do then is we can take, like, let's say this is our local value, and I'm going to take it down so that I have some room to play with my light. So I can actually just straight up calculate if I want a light that is, let's say, yellow here, put a little swatch of yellow, say that's my light color. So I can look at how this travels. Yeah, if I'm working digitally, it's nice because we have a literal readout. So I can see that my value goes up about this much, right? As I'm going there. My saturation does not significantly change. And then I can see that my hue goes up as well. And so what that means is, depending on how strong my light is, I can basically take my local value, I can go up in the direction of the light, and I can go up in the direction of the light. And this will give me a reasonable light color for this local color. You see that? And if I make my light stronger, let's say, okay, I want uh, like to kind of crank up the value of the light, like making it a brighter light, then it'll influence it even more. This is also why if you ever go into like a a room that's lit with like red light, everything is red. Even things that have a local color of blue or green or purple or whatever. If the only light in your scene is red, it's going to pull everything so strongly towards red that some of the other colors just stop existing. You'll also see this if you look at like underwater scenes or like footage of going under the ocean, because at some point blues, like the reds, will get essentially filtered. Some of these warms up here will get filtered out because the water has kind of a bluish local value. And so the deeper you go, everything gets pulled more and more into your blues, and you can take like an orange or a red like baton underwater, and if you go far enough it'll eventually end up kind of grayish, because that there's no light to refract off of these colors. So light, that's like the simplest version of how light works. It basically takes your local value and color and pulls it in the direction of light, equivalent to however bright the light is. So if I wanted to light this little blob with same color light, still somewhere up in here, but just very faint, like it's not a very strong light, I would just pull it up a little bit. Pull it up a little bit here, and then we get a dimly lit blob. Um, okay, so that's like very, very basics. Let me just see if I'm missing anything. I did set up real quick. Oh, it was Blender that crashed. Well, I had a Blender scene. What do you think? Is it worth it? That's probably worth it. We'll do a real quick one. Blender's great for 3D programs are great because you can basically simulate that and set that same thing up. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a sphere here. This is not a Blender tutorial, but it's just nice because it allows us to kind of see. Okay, so here I'm going to give this a value shader here. I'm going to say that this ball is that same kind of orangey color. Right now it's quite dark because we don't have any lights in the scene, so I'm going to go ahead and light here, and I'm going to make that light yellow. And we can see kind of the same thing. We're getting it pulled in that same direction. One other note, and this is why I wanted to set this up in Blender. The type of material does matter. So for example, if this is metal, you'll see that our values shift. The way that it's pulled up towards the color of the light does not change, but how much diffusion we get changes, and also how light or dark our values are change, right? Same thing if I make this a very smooth ball, for example, now we can see the shape of that light. It doesn't really change the color, but it does change how it diffuses. That's just important because like if I take this, for instance, a perfectly not rough and a perfectly metallic ball, in this case, this never happens in real life, but it's perfectly reflecting the light and there's no diffusion whatsoever. So just extra interesting bits and bobs to think about. Mostly the point of this was just to show, it's kind of like showing your work, right? So we just calculated this in 2D and then we can throw it into 3D. My light color is probably not exactly right, but we can see we got kind of a similar effect. And we can also see if I take my light and I take the power down, I had said kind of a weak light would give us this color, and we can go in Photoshop and we can see, looks like I have my base color wrong, but we see a similar kind of a vibe, right? Okay, so with that in mind, moving right along, that we kind of covered how that affects colors. So emulating that traditionally means that we have a light value and we're basically just pulling stuff up towards it. If we have, let's say, a blue ball, let's bring on other different colors. We're not working in oranges this time. And we want to light it with a, again, kind of yellowish light. Light will always take the shortest possible path. So in this case, it's a little bit tricky because we can see that like we're pretty much exactly opposite on the wheel. In this case, it'll probably go through the greens because we can see on our color wheel here, if we have blue and yellow, it's slightly faster to go around this way than it is to go around the long way, right? So starting with our blue, we'll probably go up through the greens and into the yellow, or maybe kind of through here. Most colors will also transfer through the neutrals. So this is another color theory thing, just real quick. If I want to take this blue and I want to make it feel warmer, I can also go neutral like this. that neutral is going to feel warm in relation to the blue because we're technically still going in this direction, right? Um, the only point of knowing that is just because it gives us different paths we can have our light take depending on how stylized we want our colors to be. So I'm going to take this blue, I'm going to push it kind of this way. I'm going to bring the saturation down, and I need to bring it lighter in value. And this would give us kind of a blue ball lit with a yellowish light, right? Now, this is kind of the way to do it traditionally for the most part. You can use like color palettes for it. You can, in some cases, mix the color that you're wanting your light to be in with your base color. It works a little bit differently than digital because traditional pigments are subtractive, which means the more pigments you mix, you're going to go towards essentially black eventually. Because with each pigment, you're essentially adding wavelengths that will not refract off of that. And so if you mix just every color imaginable together, you're going to end up with black eventually, or a very dark brown. With digital, because of our digital screens emit light, it's actually additive, which means if we mix every possible color together, it will go towards white. So that is one other like major thing that's worth knowing. As far as digital versus traditional, the color mixing does work a little bit differently. So if you're a traditional artist and you want to like dig into how colors work with your specific medium, you're going to want to find like a specific resource for that. Most paints and stuff, they'll work kind of similarly, but for instance, oil paints compared to gouache compared to watercolor, they are all a little bit different. A good example is like with watercolor, your water is essentially your white, assuming you're working on white paper. Versus with gouache, if you add water, you're just going to end up with a lighter version of that same hue. So I can't really give a perfect blanket for all traditional, but I can say that the color theory remains the same. The colors you choose to mix in to get different colors will change compared to digital. Okay, now most people that are interested in this are probably digital artists. So we want to take a look at some digital workflows. So what we can do is if we're working with layer masks, we can have our layer mask here. And then I'm sure most people are familiar with the like, okay, put overlay on it, pick like a yellow, right? And then this is your light now. And we'll see, actually, interestingly enough, that gives us basically the same color we just calculated over here. It's a little bit different because I started with a different base, but we get a very similar vibe, right? Um, so that checks out. That tells us, yes, we've done this correctly. Let's see. The did I pick yellow there? Thought I did. Yeah, I did. Okay. So that's one way of doing it, but that will give you fairly flat looking materials. And the reason for that is if we go back to our blender here, we can see that things like the roughness of the ball do affect how the light shows on it. And so if we shade everything with just the same exact approach without any regard for material, you're going to end up with a scene where everything looks kind of like clay. And that's another thing you'll see sometimes in beginner art where there's not any differentiation between the different types of materials because materials do refract differently. So we're going to take this same basic approach and just make it a little bit more refined. Let me add a strip across this ball of a different material. So different local value. We'll just go ahead and make it like a cue ball or something. Something simple. So what we can still do is we actually can still use a single layer for our lights. I usually set up my scenes by just going, just calling it yellow, calling it light. And then the other thing that we have to make sure, you can either work dark to light or you can work light to dark. Or actually, weirdly enough, you can work from middle out, but it's an extra step. Usually for me, it makes more sense to add light. So what this means is we need to put our local values into shadow first. If you just take your like perfect local values and then add light to it, you're going to end up with a very high key image, which is a little bit weird. So the easiest way to do this digitally is just with the levels. And we're just going to basically take our levels down. Oops. Put that to that. Take our levels down. So this is just making everything darker. The other thing you can do, interestingly, if you want to have like a bluish ambient light, you can actually use levels for that too. We can pull everything down and more, for example, like this. But really, all that's important is that you end up with a setup where your local values are now in the shadow range. And then you can add light on top of it. So it kind of depends on the brush settings and the specific software you're using as far as which of these to do. You can do add, you can do overlay, you can do soft or hard light. See, what do I usually use? I think I usually use hard light. It just depends. Sometimes different colors work differently with these different like algorithms. So sometimes you cycle through and see what works. We're going to add a nice yellowish light like this. So here we can add our light in. And one other thing that I usually do is I will use lasso to fill my light. I'm going to clip this to that group. And then I can control the edge independently, which is very useful. So now I have all my light on its own layer, so I can fuzz this edge if I want to. If I want to have more fall off, and this is where the manual part comes in, because if we remember on our blender, depending on the material, it'll reflect more or less light. So sometimes you have to adjust it, right? You have to tweak it a little bit like this. But this is like your basic setup for controlling lights. If you want to do it the other way, if you want to lay in shadows, for example, you can also do that. You can start with basically your lit value. So your levels then would be going brighter and probably warmer. Take blue away. We'll get some more yellow. It's a little weird with levels, but we'll stick with it. And then you can do the same thing with shadow. It's just with a multiply. So here we've got light values already. We're going to set a multiply. We're going to make our shadows bluish. And we're going to put it on the other side. We'll see we end up with a similar result. As far as which way to do this, it's again just personal preference. Some people calculate better going light to shadow. Some people prefer shadow to light. Some people prefer to work out. These will all give you slightly different end results. So at the end of the day, you got to experiment with it a little bit. For me, I almost always lay in local values and then add light to them. One other random thing, just as an option, if you don't want to mess with these kind of layer modes and you just want to like have more control, you can do that in two ways. You can use gradient map coloring, which is much more advanced, and I think we're not going to go into right now, but the TLDR being that you'll set up essentially a gradient map and clip it to each of your individual materials. And what that will allow you to do is, assuming you have your values set up, you can control how each material interacts with the light. So I guess I will give an example because I realize it's just not enough to just talk about it. So you can go gradient map like this, and I can clip it here to my ball. And here, basically, this left side of the gradient is our shadows, and the right side is light. Gradient maps only look at value. So for example, I could say my shadow. In this case, it's because we have a darker value to the blue. So I could say that's going to go down like this. And then I could say my light is going to go up like this. And you can also set stuff in between. This is something to play around with. Basically, what's happening here is it's saying our light value, if we switch to grayscale, is somewhere around here. So it's assigning this color to our light value. Our dark value is somewhere around here, so it's assigning this color. But what we can do is if we want our dark values to be different, like if we want to specifically make it go through a different color. So if we're going from like purple to yellow, and we want to make it go through like a really saturated green for some reason, we can just force that with a gradient, which you cannot do uh, with just a single layer. It's not super common that you need to do this. There's a lot of Asian artists that really do this super well. I'm going to set some values up on our ball so we can see that transfer. So I'm just going to do another layer. Like I said, I'm just painting in black essentially because I've got the gradient map already. So here up to here, let's say, you can see we're going from that purplish into the greens, or the greens basically, and up into yellow. So that's another way you can do it if you want to control really specifically on a material basis. And usually what I'll see is you'll have a gradient map for like metal or something, and you'll clip that to all of your metal masks and go through. This is getting a little bit lost in the sauce, but it's worth mentioning because we're talking about workflows. I just want to throw some ideas out so that as you're, depending on the style of art that you're doing and what you're trying to accomplish, you've got kind of the tools for that. And then, yeah, you can also work out from the center. So if you wanted, you could ignore this levels, start with your local values that are all kind of in a mid-range, and then you could actually add light and shadow like this. This will give you more contrasty images. And it's an extra step. Again, it's just kind of dependent on what you want to do and what you're trying to accomplish. It will give you higher contrast. It doesn't really give more control, I wouldn't say. It's just a different approach. If you are a traditional artist, especially if you work or if you're used to working from mid-value paper, where you'll like lay in charcoal for your darks and then like white Conte crayon or something for your lights, this workflow will make the most sense to you because you're used to shadow mapping and lights. So another way of working. Okay, now you'd had a question specifically about like patterns and stuff and how can that affect and how does that change? So I'm gonna, for the purposes of this, I'm gonna go ahead and set things up um, as, maybe I'll make a new demo here. 1 second. Get rid of this because it's driving me crazy. I'm gonna grab a different color so we're looking at something a little bit different. And we're gonna just set up a mask. We're gonna imagine we've got like a carpet or something that's rolled, with this being our local value. And then let's say we want some sort of like a crisscross of silk on it. So that'll give us two different materials um, and some different local values and colors and stuff. So you'll set up your base mask for your carpet in this case, and then you'll set up your silk. Depending on how complex your pattern is, sometimes you can, if you really want to go with like industry stuff, get rid of this. You can set up a pattern like this, and then like warp it to fit your carpet. I'm not going to do that because this is a very simple thing, but that's another way to do it. So in this case, we're going to just go like this. I'm going to say my silk is slightly darker. It's bluish. Pop it like this. Okay, so we've got our base. And these are basically the local values and colors of our materials, but we don't have any material rendering. So we can still do the same thing. I'm going to put these in a group. I'm going to make them a little bit darker. Use curves this time just to mix things up. A little bit darker and a little bit more blue. So I'm going to have a bluish local, or sorry, a bluish ambient light. And then here's my light. And for these colors, I think overlay will work best. This is all just, you just experiment with it. There's not a rhyme or reason. I'm going with based on almost nothing. It's just feels right. And let's pick a light color here, somewhere in here. Overlay, we got to go brighter. I'm just going to mess around with this until I get a color that feels right to me. I'll clip it there. Okay, that's pretty contrasty, but we'll say that's fine. So what this workflow allows is we can control our edges, first of all. So I can say, okay, I want the light to fall off down here. And I want, let's say, a hard cast edge here. So we can control all of that. This is what's going to give you your three-dimensional read. But now the light's interacting the exact same with both of our materials, which we don't want. So what we can do is we can basically control click on our other material here, and then I can adjust how the light works with that individually. So first of all, we can split it out into its own light layer like this, where now I have a separate light for my silk. And so I can say, okay, the light reflects off it less, or maybe it reflects less off of this one and the silk is more contrasty or whatever it may be, right? The other thing that allows us to do is determine, like in Blender, where we saw how far the light kind of diffused. If we want to control the diffusion on it, we can basically go in here and pull out some of the light because the light might not diffuse exactly the same across all our materials. So I can say, okay, actually this silk doesn't catch as much light. So I'm just going to pull the light down in that area like this. And so now we're starting to get that sense of different materials. The other thing you can do is, since you've got it on its own layer, you can also just change the color. You can say, well, this is blue silk, and I'm going to say it refracts more of the light color. So I can actually take my hue up and I can paint in slightly more saturated light like this if I want to. And it'll just, if I lock this, oops, let me just grab a selection here so I'm not painting outside the lines. So I can now go in without painting outside the lines, so I don't have to worry. I can just use a nice big brush. And I can add like a stripe of reflectivity if I want. I can make it reflect differently like this. So now we're starting to get a totally different vibe. This is less principally based or less, what's it called? Less physically based, but more artistic. It gives you more control. Very technically, if you have a light in your scene, the light is affecting everything. But the materials will depend on, like, depending on their local color and stuff, they'll refract different amounts of light, different colors of light, stuff like that. So usually you can split your lights out depending on material, or just to make things even more complex, you can get it kind of close and then go in with an overpaint layer at the very end and just touch everything up. And this is usually for like illustration stuff. This will be the easiest way to do it. You get everything kind of like 80% of the way there. I don't know what happened to my scrubby zoom, but that's not okay. So for illustration stuff, usually you'll get it close, and then depending on how much like specific detail you want to push into this, you'll then just sample into your colors that you've got here. So you could say, okay, like there's a little border here that I want to go ahead and catch that border like this. Maybe I catch some threads of the silk. And this is at this point just sampling colors and painting it directly. This is a great way to do hair as well. You'll set up these kind of ribbons of hair, and then you can go in and detail to your heart's content. And then same thing, if we want to say, okay, like I want this to pay more attention to light, so and pull it up like this and try some like nice saturated kind of colors like this might look interesting, whatever. Okay, I think that's covered like a whole bunch of different workflows. Usually, again, for me, I will set up my masks on their own individual layers so that if I decide I hate that color, I can just go through and change it. In theory, what's going on? Why is that? Oh, it's because I have a selection still. Oops. There we go. So yeah, I can if I decide like, oh, this sucks, I'm gonna make it more yellow. Oh, this sucks, I want to make it more purple now. Like whatever, I can control that, and you'll see how it's just affecting that material because of how I've set my layers up. So that's very handy. And then within that, I'll basically just set up a generic light that I have affect absolutely everything. And then I will go in on those masks and adjust how the light interacts with each individual material. So if I have leather, silk, and metal in my scene, for example, I would just have masks for like all the leather, each different color of silk, and then all the metal, assuming it's the same. And then I can just control click those masks and adjust those materials specifically. So in this case, let's have in our overpaint, I want a little bit more reactivity of the silk. I want it to just come up and feel a little bit more vibrant. So I'm going to basically select that mask and just get rid of this in this case. Oops. Every time I try to like set these up logically and like, okay, this will be great. I'm going to like make it nice and clean. And then inevitably I end up with a worse result than if I just set it up the way I normally do. But yeah, so I can now go in here and I can essentially I'm stylizing at this point, right? We're designing the colors. So I want this to really be a more shimmery kind of a fabric. So I can just go in and do that. Okay, I think that's everything I had. I do have a little demo. Let's see how we're doing on time. Oh my God, I've talked for way too long. So we'll go ahead and do a little demo here, basically taking a look at those same principles applied to this. And I was going to render it all the way up, but I think we will truncate it a little bit so that people don't fall asleep. So going on in here, this is his finished result. The artist on this is even Emerson. He's the same guy we just watched. And in this case, he's rendering from the middle out. So these are fairly light values. I would say he's mostly adding shadow, but he does add some highlights on some of this. You can see we get more highlight on the leather. Is it gonna? Yeah, it's gonna do it again. You can see we get more highlight on the leather than we do on the fur, just because the leather is gonna refract more of that. So yeah, let's just go ahead and go in real quick. In this case, since he's working from the middle value, I'm gonna add shadow. And multiply probably works. And I'm going to fiddle with the color on this shadow a little bit to try to get a similar result. This looks actually pretty close, but it's too saturated. So that's pretty close. Still too saturated though, darker. Okay, cool. So we've got this is our shadow color for the scene. And then we can basically block in our main shapes of shadow. So this is basically the same as shadow mapping if you're doing it traditionally. I'm going very quick just because I want to just show the general workflow. So here we're pulling this all darker. I think actually I could go even a little darker. So this is where it's nice to have it on its own layer. I can just take that lightness down even further. So I can always go back and control if I want like more blue or less blue. I don't have to repaint anything. And that's what makes this a really good industry workflow, because inevitably you're going to end up having to change like colors and how dark it is and how light it is and contrast and all of this stuff. So I'm doing basically like my overall forms. Basically, we're thinking in terms of value right now. We're not even really worrying too much about color, because we've set up he's set up the base colors. He's got some kind of color variation in them. But then we've also set up essentially our shadow color. And so this becomes just a binary, like what's my edge and where is the shadow located, essentially is what I'm thinking about. Which is what's nice about this workflow, because you have to think about a lot less. Let me get some more flow in here so I can get this a little darker. And you can also layer these. So I can see immediately that I'm not getting as contrasty as he is, which is fine, because he's direct painting this. He's not using this workflow. Um, he's just like raw dogging the colors as far as I can tell, which is insane, but power to him. But we can emulate it with an indirect workflow, just the same. Okay, so I can make these darker if I want to just duplicate the layer like this, and then I can pull away from where I don't want it. Like this, and then we can also pull our lights up. This is where you can tell, this is why I can tell that he's not using a workflow like this, is because his colors are changing depending on material. So he's probably going in, zooming in and just rendering out this leather or just rendering out this fur. But for the purposes of the demo, we'll do the same thing. So I'm going to do probably a soft light. He's got a cool light on this, so I'm going to set my light to bluish. And we'll go in here as well and just hit some of those areas of light. This is too blue, so again, I have this all in its own layer, so I can just tweak it. Too saturated, not light enough. I can also mess with like soft light is not going to affect the color very much. Hard light is affecting it too much. Overlay looks okay actually, but I might do hard light at a low opacity. So again, this is where we run into that like different algorithms for adding and multiplying colors on top of each other will work slightly differently. So it kind of changes depending on illustration as far as which one might be the best. This is way too saturated, but just want to get you guys the idea basically. As I'm noodling on this, I know I've just thrown a huge amount of information out. So are there any immediate questions? Or is this the part where I learned that I've been disconnected for 20 minutes? Okay, looks like we're good. Questions, huh? Fair enough. Correct. Yeah. I would basically go in, I would first set up just a global light and God, this scrubby zoom. I would first set up just a global light. Yeah, probably is what crashed it earlier. And it's gonna be a pain. That's okay. Anyway, so yes, basically that's what I would do. I almost always set up at minimum like form lighting. So what I mean by form lighting is like you get your overall shape and then you just airbrush in kind of your general like primary forms essentially. Um, and that gives like a reasonable starting point to color pick into. And then from there, you can set up your general light, which will pull all your colors. You're essentially gamut masking it, right? You're pulling all your colors in a specific direction, and then you can render into that from there. So in this case, I can see still that my light is just too blue. So I can take my saturation down, and then we start ending up with closer to the kind of colors that he's got. And from there, it's just fiddling with it. However long you want to sit and render, just grab your rendering brush and kind of dig in. You've got basically your full spectrum of color to pick from. So you can, if you want to make this less sharp, more sharp, however much you want to do. If I want to have the leather react more, I can just go in and pick a brighter color here for my leather like this, and then soften it out for here, whatever. But yes, that's does that answer your question or yeah, if you want that specific painterly look like this, you kind of just have to like set it up and then at some point you're just going to be rendering materials. There's really no like fast workflow around it. For me, I don't usually go that in depth on my materials rendering because I do mostly concept art. So a materials indication is enough for concept art. Um, where I'll have kind of generally like, okay, this is metallic, this is leathery, this is whatever. But I don't usually have to go in quite to that amount of detail and like really render stuff out. But you can. I mean, you can use this baseline and you can see I'm basically just sampling off the canvas here. So I need like whatever I want to render this little fold of the nose here. I can just sample and do that. And I'm just paying attention to values and edges mostly. Same thing here. Can get my little mouth, can get this coming up. And we're basically thinking again, we to wrap it back to the beginning, we started in terms of like warmer, cooler, lighter, darker, right? And so we're using that same heuristic here. We're just looking at um, warmer, cooler, lighter, darker. So here, if this is too cool, I can pull it warmer, and I can do that in this case probably by going up because we're already basically in the grays. One other interesting thing, which took me a while to understand. So if you're using a hue wheel and you've got grays on the left, you can shift the crap out of the hue and it'll still work if you're pretty close to the left side. And the reason is that this is perfect gray, right? So if my hue in this case is right here, or sorry, my saturation is right here, we're almost gray, which means I can, when I want to go warm with this color, I can literally tap just directly over to the other side and you see it just gets a little bit warmer. But if you're over here somewhere, you have to be more subtle with your hue shifts because if I just tap here, these are going to clash. You see? So the further in the grays you are, the more you have to shift the hue wheel to get the effect. The more saturated you are, the less you have to shift the hue wheel. So if I'm over here somewhere and I want it to be a little bit warmer, I'm going to move it like a tiny bit and it's going to definitely read as warmer. You see that? So another just random thing to note. So here, when I tap on this, I see that I'm very close to the grays. So if I just move it a little bit, it's not going to show. If I want to make it warmer, I'm just going to click over to the warms, and I'm basically going through the grays into that's just the hue wheel version of what it is that we're doing. So yeah. The other nice thing about this is, and this goes back to like what he did in the video, is he did this like study. Well, he did a couple studies actually for this. So he did, he started with some, just gonna play it again. He started with some just line work studies. This is like line work and anatomy studies, right? He's just drawing horses, but he's not worrying about value, which makes sense. He's trying to get the proportions down. He's trying to find course, that he likes and something that's interesting. And then he settles on this dumpy guy. He's like, great. Now what he's doing is he's looking at materials and doing a general color study here. He's looking at like, okay, how light or how dark does this go? Like, how does this reflect the light, right? And he didn't get very detailed with it. He just pulled it up to like here, basically. And this represents kind of, this is the same as like a material ball. It's just like a specific material ball. He's got kind of like how much color variation is in the fur. How does that react with the light? How light and dark does it go, right? And then he messed around with another one here very briefly, which is probably too fast to even grab. Okay, so same thing. You'll see he ignored the hair for the most part. He's just focusing on the fur. He's just trying to get like what's the value range for that material. And then he did his lines and he started coloring. He's like, okay, crap, I don't know what kind of color setup I want. So he picked this as an example of something with interesting lighting and he did a little study of it. And so here, I think you'll even see him draw. Yeah, he's got, here's his key light, here's his fill light, right? And so he's saying, okay, this is a cool light. Here's my key light, here's my fill. And then he's going to apply the same thing here. So he's got his, essentially, here's his material studies. His under sketch here is essentially his anatomy. He's got his local colors that he's pulled for his specific character, but he's pulling off of this as a material for like locals. And then he's going to start lighting, and you see here is his key and here's his fill. And so that's how he's applying that study basically. He's even pulling like his example is a little warmer. He probably thought this was too cool. So he pulled this a little bit warmer on the background, but he's still using a cool light and it's still the same kind of lighting and it's still affecting it in a similar way. And then eventually he hides it and here he just like, I don't know, raw dog material renders for, and then it's just done. It's like draw the rest of the owl. um, but yeah, so that's basically, as far as I can tell, like the reasons that those flashed up on the screen, the approach he took, and why he took it. Just at least my take on it. You can also see here he's got significantly higher reflectivity on the metal bits, a little bit less on the leather, a little bit more satiny on the fur, right? So he's just differentiating all of his materials through the values, which ultimately the values are what make the materials read, not the color. And then we talked a little bit about that last week. But again, if we go ahead and pull this up here, oh my God, it's like a meme. All right, if we pull this up here like this, make it bigger and switch it to value, we can still still tell exactly what all these materials are, right? We can still tell this is fur, this is leather, this is metal. It's just the value structure is good. Incidentally, if you were like rendering in black and white, you could also just render this up like this and then gradient map it and just lock it to different things, like different materials, would get you a similar end result. Um, but with less color variation, because he put a lot of manual color variation and hue variation into the fur, which gives it a very interesting painterly look. So, okay, long-winded demo today. Are there any other questions about any of the stuff we covered? Perfect. We'll let that chat open. Oh yeah, thank you, Laura. I don't know. I had this open on my phone, but it wasn't updating. So yeah, good call. I probably need to update that. Web colors for the color picker. Um, yeah, go ahead, Janie. I don't know if this is your question or if you had a separate question. What's it do? Web colors for the color picker. Web colors for the color picker. Uh, oh, oh yeah, the web color sliders. Those basically don't matter at all for digital artists. This will essentially lock it to colors that can very accurately be displayed, I think, on a screen. You can also get maybe it's not in Photoshop, but some programs will also allow you to clamp to only pigment colors. So you won't put like a saturated pink that doesn't exist in print. But web color basically does the same. You're basically min-maxing it so that the most possible screens will be able to tell. like to accurately display that color. I've basically never used it because depending on how the screen is calibrated, it will massively affect the art already. And it can actually affect color and value. And on top of that, every single screen is going to be calibrated slightly differently. That's why if you have like a screen tablet, for example, and you make it perfect on the screen tablet, and then you send it on Discord and you pull it up on like your main tablet, and it's like, what the hell? These look super washed out. Those screens are calibrated differently. Um, and unfortunately, there's basically no way to solve that. You just kind of do the best you can. There will be a portion of people who view your digital art and it will look really washed out and they won't understand. Um, but yeah, in theory, the web color sliders will lock it to things that the most possible like screens should be able to see. But I don't know. I've never used them. I just know that they're for like UI design, especially. We'll use that. Yeah. Um, What shortcuts? Yeah. You can use this because it'll, I mean, it's basically like a 5 value scale, but it's up to you. Only web colors. Yeah, that'll do it too. Um, Interesting. This almost looks like it's locking it to like 64-bit. Maybe that is what it's doing. Hmm. Anyway, TLDR, not super useful for digital art. Might be useful for pixel art, but are there recommended palettes or a place to look at different IRL light study in comparison to environment? No recommended palettes. I mean, everything's relative is the problem. So, like, if you take a palette and then you're like, oh, I want X specific light, like that palette's immediately useless. Or if you change the setting, like, same thing. That's why if you take a character that was painted indoors and you try to put them in an outdoor scene, they just won't mesh. It'll just look out of place. It's because the ambient light and the different lights don't line up. Um, yeah, and that's something if you're photo bashing, incidentally, like photo bashing for concept art, you spend a huge amount of time basically trying to make your light colors, your light shadow colors kind of mesh so that it feels like it sits in the scene. Um, as far as light studies, honestly, films are great. Like film stills are awesome because they are color graded, but they're usually color graded very artistically. Other than that, paint from life. That's really the only other like paint from life. You can paint from photos too, but photos like cameras will also clip your values and your colors in a specific direction. So that's part of why like if you look at fine art and you see like whatever the sunset scene, it's just like, oh my god, it's amazing, and you just can't quite get the same look with a photograph. That's why. It's because assuming the artist is able to correctly interpret the colors that they're seeing onto the canvas, you could argue that it is the most accurate version of what that person saw at that point because it's not getting filtered through a screen, it's not getting filtered through a lens. And colors and values specifically. Yeah, sometimes it can be hard. It's very hard. The easiest way is just to do it a lot, and you'll start to get better at it. But there's no like cheat sheet for that, unfortunately. Yeah. One thing I will also say, if you're working traditionally, the mask, like the gamut mask of the colors you're able to achieve, will also be dependent on which pigments you are using. So a lot of painters, especially oil painters, who want to have very, very vibrant colors, will not work RGB, they will work CM1. And the reason for that is because you have a higher threshold of saturation with cyan, magenta, and like bright lemon yellow, which means because traditional colors mix subtractively, as soon as you add two colors together, your saturation is going to go down. And so it's very hard. I mean, there's a couple exceptions, but for the most part, it's very hard to keep a perfectly high saturation. So you want to start with very high chroma colors. And then in theory, you'll be able to get a wider range of color. I'm simplifying a little bit. Some of it is because I'm not a traditional artist, so I only have a general understanding of it, and I don't want to give like incorrect information. But then some of it also is because it's so dependent on like your materials, your medium, like your everything. So it's hard to generalize. But yeah, you will see. I wish I could remember the guy's name. He paints these massive, like full wall level um, landscape paintings, and they look photorealistic, but he's got these beautiful, bright, vibrant colors. He does like only landscapes. And yeah, he works CMY in order to get that. Yeah, I have to think. If I remember it, I'll link it somewhere. But yeah, in general, if you ever see like those really almost like digital looking colors, I can almost guarantee the painter was working CMY, not RGB. RGB, it's very hard to get enough saturation into your starting colors to keep a highly saturated end result. Cool. Um, yeah. Any other questions? We'll open it up here. I can kill the recording. We'll open it up for just general art questions real quick.